Hello, and welcome to a detailed look at my Super Mario Maker 2 level, Chromatic Cavern. I've received quite a few questions about how this level works and how I went about making it, so here's the answer. In this video, I'll be going over the initial inspiration for the level, the mechanisms and methodologies I used in its creation, and the mistakes I made, as well as other changes I would have made in retrospect. If you haven't seen or played the level yet, I recommend doing so first. The level code is on screen, and you can find a video of a playthrough in the description. The central mechanic of the level is an automatic on-off switch that uses music blocks to create an audio cue. The idea first came about when a friend of mine expressed their desire to make a level with this kind of automatic switch, and one that would persist as the player scrolled the screen. After I created a couple messy prototypes, my friend discovered this level, Cloud Jump, which seemed to accomplish exactly what they wanted. Since the mechanism is never on screen, and editing downloaded levels is no longer possible in Mario Maker 2, I had to make some guesses to reverse engineer it, and came up with this structure.
Here we go!
Further on in the level, the automatic switching speeds up, changing on every beat instead of every other beat. We can replicate this simply by adding a second on-off switch to our contraption. However, here we can see an issue arise if the player's movement speed is different than the creator intended. If both mechanisms are loaded at once, the switching speed becomes unpredictable, resulting in an unintended death. This led me to rethink the design into something more horizontally compact, resulting in this.
Here we go!
This design has a few advantages over the flat version. Most importantly, we can be sure that the entire mechanism will cleanly and predictably despawn. This is because the shell always enters the leftmost tile between each note. As such, once the player moves far enough to despawn the shell, we can be sure that it won't play more than one extraneous note. This also makes it trivial to locate the exact tile where the mechanism will stop. Once we know where this despawn point is, we simply place a copy of the entire thing 3 tiles past the screen boundary on the right. Now, when we walk past the despawn point of the shell on the left, the one on the right immediately starts up. Another benefit of this vertical layout is that it's more flexible when it comes to modifying its tempo. Changing the width from 5 blocks, to 4 blocks, to 3 blocks, and removing the parachute from the buzzy shell all work to create different trajectories and ultimately different tempos. As a side note, the speed of a buzzy shell bumped by a sideways trampoline is very strange. A parachute alters this speed even if the shell is never airborne, and the shell travels faster when bumped to the right than it is to the left. I'm sure that these properties could be used to create even more variations on this auto-switch mechanic. However, this 3-block width version is probably the fastest tempo that can be made with a single shell. This is why I created 2 different mechanisms for the final area in the level.
Here we go! Here we go!
Using 3 separate shells adds some complexity, but allows the tempo to be brought even higher. Unfortunately, the extra width means that the useful range of this quick tempo version is much smaller, since the shells travel further left and thus despawn quicker as the player moves forward. Complicating matters even further is the fact that all 3 shells need to be spawned and despawned simultaneously to ensure that everything stays in sync. This first mechanism is located directly above a pipe transition, so the shells can be placed anywhere within the screen width. Then, we ensure that the leftmost tile that each shell reaches is aligned horizontally, so that when one shell despawns, the others will as well. The second mechanism, however, is scrolled into existence by the player, so in this one, the starting positions of all 3 shells have to be horizontally aligned. This makes the first shell travel even further left to keep the 3 of them synchronized, giving this version the smallest range of them all. It can only be used for about a screen and a half before the shells start to despawn, and on top of that, each of them will despawn at a different time, resulting in the effect breaking down completely. As luck would have it, however, this was the point where I was running out of room in the level anyway, so a simple scroll lock and an exit pipe prevent any of the shells from despawning. There are some drawbacks to these mechanisms as they're currently designed. First of all, because we prioritize loading a new mechanism as the player moves to the right, if the player backtracks to the left, there will be dead zones of a handful of tiles where the effect comes to a halt. This is because the shell on the right will despawn before the shell on the left can load. While creating my level, I marked these sections with groups of munchers and designed around this limitation. This early platforming section, for example, has nothing of interest in the dead zone, pushing the player to jump back to this platform, at which point the previous mechanism loads again, and all is well. Second, due to the loading mechanics of Mario Maker, even with the most careful placement, there's still roughly a 1-block gap where the shell on the left will despawn without spawning the shell on the right. The alternative is a same-sized space where both shells are spawned simultaneously, which is much less desirable. I used semi-solid platforms to give me a quick visual indicator of the range of each mechanism, to minimize the chances of a player stopping on one of these seams, so to speak. Some may be wondering if icicles could be used to keep this mechanism persistently loaded, since objects on icicles are never despawned. It is possible to make a persistent automatic on-off switcher using this approach, but not with the audio cue. And lastly, perhaps my biggest disappointment with this mechanism, it's quite noisy. The shell bumping around is always audible, and even in the Super Mario World theme where the shell bouncing is more subtle, the player will always hear the bounce of the trampoline. This is a bigger issue than it might seem, as more than a couple playtesters were counting shell bounces instead of listening for the tones when trying to work out the timing. With that covered, we'll take a quick run-through of the level itself. My goal was to create a relatively tranquil level, focusing more on atmosphere and puzzles than enemies for the most part. I also wanted to try to follow a more traditional level design approach by introducing a concept, building on that concept, introducing a twist or two as they progress through the level, and culminating in a final challenge. All of my observations in this section come from watching others play my level, so bear with me if they sound like generalizations. At the beginning, most players opt to get this mushroom, as it's placed just out of reach unless the platform is active. At this point, most aren't clear yet on why or how the switching is occurring, but this next platforming section tries to remedy that. The barrier of same-colored blocks at the top prevents the player from brute forcing. They have to at least have some idea as to the timing before they can proceed. Next, a small twist in the form of an optional puzzle. This puzzle is one of the reasons I used so many enemies as decoration in the beginning. This lone Monty Mole in a relatively open space sticks out in comparison to the other groups of enemies in smaller spaces, and the only brick block in the level right after the player is given a mushroom practically begs to be broken, hopefully capturing and sustaining the player's attention as the Monty Mole follows them around. Interestingly, I've found that even when players don't see any clear reward for helping the mole get home, most still feel compelled to do it. This puzzle also reminds the player that the conveyor belts will change direction on each switch as well, without having to put them in any danger. This is useful information for the next section. Here we see our first subtle increase in tempo. I aim to make this fairly forgiving while still forcing the player to learn the timing more precisely, particularly with this jump. This extra blue block provides some safety if the player jumps too late, and the vertical drop gives the player some leeway if they jump a bit too early. Even if the jump is completely botched, the player can run underneath the conveyor belt or simply wait for the next switch as their invincibility frames expire. Next is a puzzle I've seen approached in a surprising variety of ways. I positioned these semi-solid platforms like this as I felt the player would naturally try to fill in the gap while holding the Koopa shell. In this position, releasing the shell on the first tone while the blue blocks are solid will provide the solution. Some players threw the shell from a completely different position, while others took the munchers as a cue to use a damage boost. I had considered making this slightly easier during testing by replacing the two center on-off blocks with ground. However, most testers picked up on the timing fairly quickly despite the trial and error nature of the puzzle, so I kept it the way it is. Next is a more lengthy and difficult version of the same puzzle. The last thwomp is a bit interesting since it's not very common a player has to consider the timing of a thwomp rising back up to its starting point. Running parallel to the shell provides a quick solution here, and gives the player access to a second key, as well as a glimpse at one of the auto-switch mechanisms. This final area lacks any decorative objects, as I didn't want to risk distracting the player. This is also why the on-off platforms are equally sized and spaced. This section is all about consistent rhythm, and introducing mix-ups felt a bit contradictory. The only intended risk of instant death in the level comes at the hallway leading to the secret ending. Players with both keys that make it through here get a glimpse of one of the fast tempo mechanisms, as well as a handful of coins and 1-ups, as that unfortunately remains the only mechanical reward that can be provided to players. By far, the biggest mistake I made was my assumption that keys saved with checkpoints. All of my playtesting was done in the editor rather than CoreSpot, so I didn't discover this until the level was uploaded and people had already played it. This, of course, makes the secret ending much more difficult to attain than I'd intended. In hindsight, I would definitely replace the keys with key coins, which do save with checkpoints until they're all collected, or only require one key to get the secret ending. The most common complaint I've gotten is that the second shell puzzle is a bit too risky when the player has to retrieve the shell after a missed throw. Although I did intend this to be a bit more difficult, it may have been better to drop the shell into a one-block gap or have it fall off screen as it does in the first puzzle. I should have taken more time in the final room to ensure smoother spawning and despawning between the two fast tempo mechanisms. As it is, there's almost always a jarring restart of the tone sequence. At worst, the first mechanism activates the switch one last time while the second one is still starting up. And although not really a mistake, I would have disabled the timer in this level if it were possible, since it's at odds with the more relaxed atmosphere I was going for. A closer examination of the music blocks revealed just how lucky I was that this mechanism works for this particular level. First of all, there are only two objects that can work with this contraption: a buzzy beetle shell and a spiny shell. The buzzy beetle shell produces a nice, reverby, vibraphone-esque sound. This goes very well with Mario Maker's peaceful ambience, which I use throughout the level.
Here we go.
A spiny shell, on the other hand, sounds like this.
Here we go.
Not exactly the mellow feeling I was going for. However, you may have noticed another strange difference between the sounds made by those two shells. Normally, the pitch of music blocks moves up or down in semitones along the chromatic scale depending on the height of the block. So music blocks in these positions produce the notes E, A flat, and C. This is an augmented chord which tends to sound a bit dissonant, and it does sound somewhat off with most objects.
Here we go.
Except for the buzzy beetle shell.
Here we go.
With the help of my friend, Kit Sovereign, we discovered that this object, and this object alone, uses a 5-tone pentatonic scale instead of the 12-tone chromatic scale. Every note it can play is tuned to roughly either C, D flat, E flat, G, or A flat. This appears to be a Japanese scale called the Ryukyu scale, or Okinawa scale, from the music of the Okinawa Islands. As a result, our music blocks now produce the notes D flat, C, and A flat. This sounds particularly dreamy and ethereal compared to the augmented chord we would otherwise be stuck with. Stranger still, the scale seems to follow a very erratic pattern from the lowest pitch to the highest, and even seems to change instrumentation multiple times. Quite fortunately, the last of these instrument changes happens just one row beneath my contraption, so the sound remains consistent. To top it all off, there's no wiggle room at the top of the contraption either. because the shell needs to activate the music block from above, and because there needs to be a ceiling above the shell when it hits the note block to prevent the shell from flying off, this is the highest position we can use for a note block in this mechanism. So, to recap, the only object that makes this mechanic work without clashing with the level's atmosphere has completely unique properties that make it sound even better suited for this level than it normally would, and only within the exact vertical range I ended up using. I have no idea what gave me this kind of luck, but I'm grateful. To close out this video, here's a full view of the main level and sublevel. There are a couple of secret areas I didn't show off here or in my playthrough video, so if you like hunting for secrets, you may want to try to find them first. Thanks for watching.